away. Why can't I put this here? Try that. Can you guys hear me? I don't know how well that's actually going to work, putting it down there. I need to get a proper, what do they call it, thing to put it on. Well, if this doesn't work, I'll just delete the stream later. But this is an experiment. I've got somewhere to go today, and I figured, why not do a stream while I'm driving? And we can chat about stuff. Hang on, let me just get out on the road properly. And if it is crap, well, it was just an experiment. Grab. Yeah, audio is low. I don't know that there's much I can do about that, other than just talk more loudly, which I will try to do. So let's see, what are we going to chat about? I think there's some things I've been thinking about with respect to apologetics we could maybe chat about if I ever get out onto this road. One of the things that is of interest to me more recently is just sort of the overall strategy that apologists typically take. Let's go out here. In terms of like, what makes a good argument? I was just watching Nathan's stream that he just did when William Lane Craig and that other guy who wears the weird hat, they were talking about the Kalam. And Craig, let's see, so the other guy was saying that the Kalam isn't consistent with how he understands God's power, because the Kalam doesn't actually show that there's anything logically contradictory about an infinite past. And then so, well, why couldn't God create that? And Craig was saying, well, at most this is going to mean that the argument isn't convincing to like people who are already Christians, but the argument's designed to be used against, I think he said naturalists or something like that. I thought that was kind of a weird thing to say, because like if you're a naturalist and you're considering arguments in favor of Christianity or any form of theism, like, so suppose I'm a naturalist and then Craig convinces me that I should believe that the past can't be infinite. And then Craig convinces me with his resurrection argument that I should become a Christian. But then I'm convinced that actually, given my understanding of God's omnipotence, God could have created an infinite past if he wanted to. But then isn't that going to undermine my whole reason for believing in God in the first place if that was based on an argument that I now consider to be unsound? It's like, doesn't that give rise to an internal inconsistency or internal strains within the view? So I don't really understand how Craig thinks that's a good response. Just to say that, oh, well, it's not designed for use against Christians. But I mean, if you were a Christian, if you became a Christian because of that and other arguments, then wouldn't that undermine your and more generally, I think that this is a problem for apologetics in terms of like, who are the arguments supposed to be appealing to? Because often only people who are already believers or like leaning towards belief, people who are kind of looking for a reason to believe, if you like, often they're only going to be the ones who are going to find the premises convincing. I think this is often the case in terms of resurrection arguments in particular, where it's mostly just Christians or maybe like former Christians or people who are kind of looking, seekers, as they sometimes call themselves, they're really the only ones who find it plausible that God would raise Jesus from the dead anyway. If you're a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist or an atheist, you're generally not going to think that God would do such a thing. Or even if he did, you don't think that Jesus was like the Son of God who was providing, who came to earth to provide a sacrifice that was sort of a definitive reconciliation between God and man and all that sort of stuff. You wouldn't accept all that theology behind it, which is sort of essential to Christians, right? So, I mean, why bother with these arguments then? It's a little hard to understand why why we're supposed to regard those sorts of things as plausible. I know Richard Swinburne has written some stuff about this, where he tries to argue that these type of Christian theological beliefs should be given like higher plausibility on the basis of just sort of general philosophical considerations. I need to spend more time with that because I haven't really read much detail of that, although what I have heard from the arguments, they don't sound very convincing to me, but I guess we'll have to look into that. Let me just take a quick squiz here and see if this is actually working. Yeah, I don't have a proper... Well, actually, I did get a proper phone mount, but it sort of doesn't work with my old car. If people like can't hear me, then I might as well stop the stream. So can you actually let me know if like it's like listenable or like not listenable? Because this is just an experiment. I can try again later if this isn't working. But I kind of need to see now. Well, I'm at the lights. Where'd the chat go? Climate change. I don't know why. Can hear okay, but audio isn't amazing. Well, not everything in life is what you want it to be. I'm just wondering if there's somewhere else. Maybe I could just put it on my lap. Technically not legal though, but I mean, if I'm not actually looking at it. How is that if I just like leave it there? You might get a nice like up the chin view, but you're not watching this for the amazing visuals anyway. Is the sound better there? I don't have any microphone I can plug into it, unfortunately. Yeah. All right, well, we'll go with that. You can look up my chin and I'll just sort of chat while I'm driving. Yeah, so what was I saying? Craig arguments. Yeah, so plausibility. I don't really... I mean, I think a lot of apologetics is explicitly for the use of trying to appeal to those who are already believers, try to keep them in the faith. And I think that makes a lot of sense if you think about, well, the arguments are only convincing to people who already kind of believe or more or less believe anyway. So the premises then don't have to be plausible to those who are non-believers, right? Because they're kind of designed to be plausible to those who are more or less already believers, so it sort of makes sense there. But that's not what Craig claims, for example, in the recent discussion that I just mentioned with the hat dude, I don't remember his name, but where he was saying the Kalam is supposed to appeal to like naturalists or atheists. But I think that the thing about the Kalam is that most atheists don't find it really plausible at all. And even if you affirm both premises of the Kalam, that's consistent with atheism, right? The Kalam only establishes a cause of the universe. I mean, you can have causes that are not God. So of all the arguments for God, surely it's one of the least appealing to, it's sort of the least likely to move you away from atheism. I think the moral argument is probably one of the most successful in convincing some atheists. Not a lot, perhaps, but at least I've heard of people who find that convincing. It more directly leads you to God. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel like the strategy is kind of off here. I think that Christian apologists should focus way more on trying to explain to us why holding a Christian worldview is kind of like a good thing in that, like intellectually and I don't know, emotionally, morally, it like helps you be a better person. I guess there's sort of some of that, but mostly it feels like they're trying to hit us over the head with these arguments that they think they're trying to hit us over the head with arguments that are supposed to be like decisively convincing or something, which I don't know what the point of that is supposed to be. like what's good about being a Christian is more interesting to me than some sort of multi-premise argument that tries to deductively prove God's existence or something. But a lot of apologists don't really talk about that. And I think that Doug points out that this, like Pine Creek Doug, that a lot of it, for a lot of Christians, is just about like heaven and hell, which I think is a terrible reason to be a Christian personally, like the carrots and sticks approach. And that doesn't even really seem consistent with, I don't know, what I read of Jesus in the New Testament. I mean, he does sort of talk about that sometimes, but I mean, why would a loving God want people to worship him just because they're afraid of whatever happens if they don't? It's like that meme, right, where Jesus is knocking on the door and he's like saying, "Let me in." And the guy behind the door is like saying, "Why?" And he's like, and Jesus says, "Oh, because I'm going to save you. Save me from what? What I'm going to do to you if you don't let me in." And, I know that's not how all Christians, or maybe even most Christians, conceive of heaven, but it definitely is how some Christians seem to conceive of heaven, or heaven and hell, right? As some sort of something that God does to you if you're naughty, or if you're not saved, or if you're not preordained, or whatever it is exactly. So, yeah, like, why would God want that? It just seems really, really crass and like authoritarian. And I couldn't respect a God who even if I believed that God was doing that, I don't think I could really respect a God who did that. But I would never become that sort of Christian anyway. But okay, so that relates to something else I've been thinking about recently, which is this whole issue of free will. Obviously, the Calvinists are not kind of big into that, but a lot of the Arminian or Molinist apologists, like Craig, for example, and many others as well, make the argument that Braxton Hunter talks about this as well, that free will is critical to their philosophy and theology, because not only does it kind of explain why God created creatures like us, it's because it's really good to have freely willing creatures. Also, it's at least a partial explanation for evils and suffering in the world, because they come about as a result of free will. It's also used as a defense for like why God doesn't make himself more obvious because of free will. And so it factors in a lot of these sort of apologetic and philosophical issues. But I think insufficiently explored, okay, I don't know if I'm going to retain signal in this tunnel, but I'll just keep talking as if I do. Insufficiently explored is the question as to why, high beam on, why is free will a good thing? You can sort of understand contextually why it would be a good thing. Like, if like for humans, it's good to allow humans as they are to make their own free decisions, right? But suppose that let's take an example, right? Suppose that I was to make cook my toast. I think Rick and Morty had what did they make in Rick and Morty? It was some sort of, was it like a toast butter or something? Toast pasta? I forget what it was, right? But it was some sort of trivial implement to use with making food or whatever. So imagine if I made a toaster, right? And the purpose of it is to toast. And so is it better if I make a toaster with free will, or one that doesn't have free will, that's just entirely deterministic and, non-free will having? It's not really clear to me what having free will adds to the toaster. I mean, why is that a good thing for it to have free will? If God wanted to create creatures to worship him, is it better that they have free will, or does it matter? Like, can they just worship him without free will? It's just not obvious what the free will is doing there. And when I say free will here, I'm particularly focusing on libertarian free will. By the way, if my camera, if the stream cut out while I was in the tunnel, apologize for that. I'm talking about free will. I think it should have been all right, but one can't be sure about this sort of thing. Anyway, so why is it good to have libertarian free will? Not why is it good for us? Why is it good for God to create freely willing beings? I guess you could say God has libertarian free will, and so it's like we're created in God's image in that sense. But we're not created in God's image in other senses, right? we have material bodies and God doesn't. We're not omnipotent or omniscient. We're not all good. We don't live forever. So there's many differences. So why is that one so critical if it's the image of God argument? I'm just trying to think about how apologists or Christians typically talk about this. I think it's just usually assumed that it's just super good to have freely willing agents. But I don't think there's a good argument. Does Plantinga, or is it Swinburne who talks about this and uses this as a sort of a premise? But the thing is, if you're going to say that, I think the moral argument's pretty much off, or at least the standard moral argument is out, right? Because it can't be good to create freely willing agents independently of God, because then there's some sort of moral standard or code or whatever that exists outside of God. It's not like God can improve the moral status of the universe according to a theological voluntarist, divine command theorist, by making more free agents, because God is perfectly self-sufficient and is beholden to nothing outside of himself. So at most you could say that he has some sort of preference for making more libertarian agents, but even that can't be understood in terms of like making the universe better. It's just sort of God feels like it, I guess. But then you can't say that God is achieving a greater purpose by making free agents, right? So I think that undermines the validity of that argument as a part of the free will defense. Because the free will defense would have to say that God... So free will has to be good in order for that to serve as a counter, like a defeater for the clear harms that free will brings about. So God has to be achieving some good by making freely willing beings. But how can that be the case if there's no good outside of God? If it's just basically God can do what he wants. If he wants, he can create stuff, but he can't do harms by doing that, right? Because that would be against his nature. I'm not quite sure how all this fits together. Maybe you can make it fit. Maybe it's part of God's nature to create freely willing agents, as long as on net that's on net there's more pleasure or well-being or whatever compared to the amount of harm caused. I don't know, maybe that works, but it still can't be the case that it's like objectively good for God to do that. It might just simply be consistent with his good nature, right? It's like, so if God's going to create, he has to create something that's good, but it's not good for him to create simpliciter, right? Because that would be implying that there's some sort of standard outside of himself to create. So I think that still kind of weakens the free will defense, because it's like, well, why did God create anything instead of just not creating anything, creating nothing, or only creating beings that can experience well-being, but not cause harm to each other through free will? I think that really does weaken the free will defense. There's another problem with the free will defense that I've thought about. Again, I need to read more about this. I'm sure there's more responses, and that's that apologists seem to be like hardcore consequentialists when it comes to justifying God's actions. They say, well, look, God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evils and harm and, for people to rape and pillage and genocide and whatever. But maybe we don't think that morality works such that you can just have greater consequences, like greater benefit that outweighs that harm. This is sort of treating people as an means to an end, right? Like, do we think that it would be morally acceptable for people to just say, look, I'm going to Holocaust the Jews because I can achieve a greater moral purpose? We would really say, well, we would do that. That's still wrong. For God to do that, maybe God obeys different rules, but I think you have to be some sort of pretty strong consequentialist fundamentally for that kind of argument to work. Otherwise, you're going to say, no, it's wrong for God to put someone in a situation where they're harmed for some greater good. That's using someone as a means to an end, and not valuing their sort of intrinsic value, or however you want to phrase it. So I think that kind of puts you on a particular position in terms of ethical theory. Of course, you might say that God has a different ethical theory that applies to him than applies to humans, but that seems kind of ad hoc to me. Why would morality work differently for God? And also, I mean, that in itself is fairly implausible. Like, if you want to say God is a legitimate authority over man, legitimate authorities usually have at least I would argue, from politics and from social contract theory and things like that, they need to be held to the same standard as everyone else. They're not exceptions to the law. They may have special authority, but they don't have arbitrary ability to just sort of exempt themselves from the standards they set for other people. So I don't think it's going to work to say that God has different standards than we hold everyone else to, because that just sort of makes him a tyrant, right? Exercising arbitrary authority. He has to abide by the same standards that he requires other people of, which means that if we can't treat people as a means to an end or violate categorical imperatives or whatever, then God shouldn't be doing that either. So then that raises the question as to what's he doing with all of the horrible things that he allows to happen for some sort of greater good. I think there have been people to argue this, that if God allows harm to come to someone, then he doesn't just have to have some sort of good that comes out of that, but he has to have some sort of good that comes out of that for that specific person. It has to be on net beneficial for all of those people. And that seems more plausible to me. But then it also seems much less plausible that that's actually possible for God. So how can he compensate people that have been massively harmed by human agency or just natural disasters or other things, disease? Maybe he provides some benefit to them in heaven, I suppose, and the afterlife would be the only opportunity. It doesn't seem to happen in this life. But then that raises the question, well, it seems the afterlife has to have a lot of structure for that to work, right? It can't just be people praising God for eternity, because, I mean, where's the benefit that accrues to the people to compensate them for the harms that were inflicted on them or God allowed to be inflicted on them during life? Like, how can he compensate them if it's just sort of the same for everyone in the afterlife? It's like that there has to be some sort of benefit that can be accrued differentially. And how does that fit in with a Christian conception of the afterlife? I really have no idea. I'm sure theologians have written some stuff about this, but the question is, how plausible should we regard all of that? So I guess putting all this together, all these aspects of free will and libertarian agency and moral arguments, I just find it hard to think about how all this can fit together in a way that's consistent with Christian theology. I'm not saying it's impossible, right? I don't claim to be a theologian, but ultimately, you've got to have an account there that's at least plausible for me to take it seriously. And so this is why I don't think it's very plausible for Craig to say, well, these are just, which he typically does when people raise these sorts of problems. He says, well, these are internal issues within Christianity. And he says or implies that these aren't relevant for assessing the truth of Christianity per se. But I think that's just kind of nonsense, right? Because that's kind of like saying that, I don't know, the origin of the universe or the grounding of morality, to take two examples, are just internal issues under naturalism. But Craig's not going to accept that. He's going to take those as objections to naturalism because he thinks that they can't explain those. But then why is it illegitimate for the naturalist to hold Christianity to these standards about explaining aspects from within its own worldview? And assess that as relevant to the assessment of the plausibility of Christianity. It seems to me that everything should be on the table, right? Both worldviews should be able to provide an account for accepted phenomena as well as things that are specific to their worldview. So obviously, for instance, the atheist doesn't have to explain God's omnipotence and how that works or the afterlife, because they don't generally believe in those things. But the Christian does believe in those things. And so if they can't account for them in a way that is consistent, that's going to be a problem, even if it is in some sense like internal to their worldview. So I think that Craig trying to wriggle out of these issues by calling them internal questions is just honestly intellectually dishonest, because it's not like you could just compartmentalize. I mean, you can sort of psychologically compartmentalize, but epistemically, I don't think you can compartmentalize these different issues. They're all part and parcel of your worldview and its plausibility assessment. So I think we do need to we do need to hold the apologists more accountable than perhaps we have or typically do about these sort of internal issues. And this includes things not just like the afterlife and free will and suffering, but also issues like the incarnation and the nature of the Trinity, how to understand that. Creation, I think that's a big issue. Why doesn't a God who is perfectly self-sufficient and lacks for nothing create anything at all? It seems that he would just sort of indulge eternally in his own perfectness, right? Like, why would he sully himself with creation? That doesn't really make any sense to me. Even if you want to say that God could create if he wanted to, it doesn't seem like he could have any reason to create. So at most, what you could say is that God has no reason to create, he just creates on a whim. It's purely sort of just because he felt like it. It's not a rational action, as in a rational action taken for a reason. So by saying it's creation wouldn't be a rational action, I'm not saying it's irrational, I'm just saying it's irrational. It's sort of like if you just got up in the morning and you open your cereal cupboard and you're just like, what am I going to eat for breakfast today? And you just sort of feel like going for, I don't know, the cornflakes or whatever. You don't have to have a reason for that necessarily. I mean, some people might think that you have a reason, that is you're fulfilling your greatest desire by choosing that. But what I'm saying is that it's not clear that you have to have a reason. You may just simply choose arbitrarily for no reason because you sort of feel like it on a whim, but not because you even have a stronger desire for that than other things, or that will maximize your utility. You might make that claim, but I'm saying plausibly you don't have to claim that. You could just choose arbitrarily. So that would be the sort of analogous case for God creating. It's just like, I'm going to create this. He's not going to have a reason for it, because it seems like, well, what could the reason appeal to? It can't appeal to something outside of God because God's self-sufficient. It doesn't seem like it could appeal to his desires because God doesn't have desires that he lacks, right? He doesn't lack anything. So what desires could he have for something that's sort of not fulfilled? I don't see how God can have any desire or a reason or motive that he can sort of promote by creating. So it seems to me that at most you're going to say that God could create sort of arbitrarily on a whim. The problem with that is that Christians typically claim that God created for a reason. Like he has a plan and he has particular objectives or goals that he's sort of working out in the world. I don't know how that fits with the idea of that God is self-sufficient and therefore wouldn't really have reasons to create. Again, I'm sure theologians have discussed this. I've tried to do a little bit of reading on this, but it's kind of hard to find good material. At least I've found it difficult because it just seems that it's not discussed very much. I've read that some Christians have argued, or some theists have argued, that God he doesn't have a choice to create. It's sort of his overflowing creativity and creative impulse in some way, maybe not compels him, but leads him to create. I don't know that that's going to work for a voluntarist reading of creation, though, if it just sort of is a natural overflowing of God's creative impulses. It seems like the usual idea is that it's an explicit choice of God to create. Also, the idea that it's sort of a natural overflowing, an irresistible urge or something of God's creative impulses doesn't really seem to make very much sense of the idea that God is self-sufficient. Like, why is he still sort of growing outside of himself if he is self-sufficient in the way that is typically said? Why would he have an impulse to move beyond himself if he is perfectly fine the way he is? Doesn't really make sense to me. Maybe there's something you can say there. But I guess, again, the point I'm making here is that creation is a particularly tricky doctrine, I think. Not just, I mean, as naturalists or atheists or skeptics or whatever we want to call ourselves, we typically focus on the hows and whens of creationism versus evolution and the Big Bang and so forth. But really, if you're going to say God created, it's reasonable to ask, why did he create? For what reason? If God is a rational agent, which is the typical description of theists, then one is drawn to ask, for what reason did he create? And if one can't be provided, then I think we should be skeptical about that as a plausible explanation. So, I mean, for my purpose, the fact that theists typically can't provide, or at least from my point of view, can't provide very satisfactory answers to these sorts of questions, and when pressed, typically resort to, well, there's different options on the table, or this is an internal question, or, we don't know, or things like that. I mean, they might be honest answers, but they're not very intellectually satisfying answers. And the thing is, when naturalists use this type of argument about creation or morality or free will or whatever, apologists typically don't regard this as satisfactory. They say, that's an evasion. You're not answering the question, right? You don't have an answer. But then when they're pressed on issues that are important for their worldview, it's like okay to not have an answer or to just gesture to a plurality of answers. I think that if you can't offer plausible explanations, then that weakens the worldview. And I'm not saying a worldview has to answer every issue, right? Certainly naturalism doesn't, but I don't think any worldview does. But it's an issue of how well overall can you account for reality and sort of package that up in a consistent, coherent, plausible worldview. The more ad hoc postulates you have to add in that then themselves raise issues that can't be satisfactorily explained, the worse your explanation is, the worse your theory is. And that's one of the reasons I reject theism. I just think that typical theisms, right? A bare theism that just says God created and that's the end of it. That doesn't raise too many problems. It raises some, but the typical theisms that you see defended, like Christianity, Islam, whatever else, those raise all sorts of problems about the way that God interacts with reality and with humanity and why we exist in this way, and the moral status of his actions and of humans after the end of the world and all this other stuff. So I think that those need to be on the table when assessing different worldviews, and they often just sort of aren't. So I think that this is something that I need to read a bit more about myself, and that maybe those of us in the skeptical space need to put a bit more work into, is what to is sort of incorporating the more theological side of things. So that's one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I think that it's just something Christians take for granted a lot of the time, and probably Muslims and others as well. I know Christians better with this, with respect to this sort of stuff. They just don't think about these questions very much, or when they do, they're just sort of happy to not know the answer. And the thing is, I'm a big fan of being happy with not knowing the answer, but the problem is when that is weaponized in an inconsistent way. Okay, so if I'm a naturalist and a Christian asks me, how do you account for morality absent God? I don't think God really helps, right? But putting that aside for the moment, and let's say I don't really know. I'm not sure how it works, right? Now, the theist is liable to say that they take that as a reason to accept God because they believe that provides a better account or helps them with an accounting for morality. Likewise for creation, for example, or what happens after we die, or various other aspects, right? So the point is, it's the inability of a certain worldview to account for or provide a good explanation for certain facts, or at least purported facts, which they use as a basis, a justification for the views that they have. Now that's okay, but you need to be consistent with that. If you're going to require a good explanation of certain important to accept a worldview, that requires you to have those things explained, then that needs to be applied across the board, not just to things that naturalists perhaps have a harder time explaining. It also needs to be applied to the things that theists typically have a difficult time explaining. And the thing is that everything that naturalists have to explain, theists also have to explain. But there are many things that theists need to explain that naturalists don't need to explain at all, such as why did God create, or the moral status of God allowing suffering. Atheists just don't have to explain that. Or the nature of God. Obviously, naturalists don't have to explain about the nature of God. The Trinity introduces big issues for Christians that non-Trinitarians just don't have to worry about. Likewise, the incarnation. There's so many of these issues that you just don't have to worry about if you're not a theist. And so I think that if you're going to go down that comparative explanatory path, you need to be really careful that you're not just applying those standards inconsistently to things that you sort of think are consistent with, or to things that you think are hard for the worldviews that you disagree with to explain, but not the things that are difficult for your worldview. Alternatively, if you're going to say, look, it's all right not to know, and to say, I don't know, and to be open and so forth, then that should be applied consistently as well, right? You shouldn't require explanations for some things and be open for other things. Obviously, it depends on the extent of the some problems are worse than others, right? But you get the point that for comparative problems should lead to comparative. Similar problems should lead to similar approaches, like epistemically. So big issues like, creation, if you're going to require an explanation for that, then you should require an explanation for the nature of God, or what's going to happen, in heaven after we die, and how that fits with libertarian agency and all these other big issues. I don't think that you can just sort of adopt different standards there. And I think this is a big problem with a lot of apologists and Christians and other theists generally, is that they hold their own theology to different standards that they hold other theologies to, or other worldviews to more generally. In fact, it's very easy to see this. Nathan and I did a video back in the day, which was called something like Christian versus Mormon versus Muslim versus Jew, or something like that. And this, we looked at apologists from different religious traditions and have them, just listen to them talking about stuff and comparing what they said. And this bad apologetics video didn't get as many views as some of the others have, but it's one of my favorites because it's just fascinating to see how apologists in different religions react to apologists in religions that they're not part of, right? Basically, my sort of take on that is that the atheist apologist is just the average of apologists in all other religions. And by that I mean apologists in all other religions use pretty much the same sentiments as atheists do, and as each other do, with respect to religions that they're not of. So criticisms of the Trinity, Muslims have similar criticisms as atheists do. Criticisms of like Jesus and the resurrection, Jews say similar things to what atheists do, and Muslims a little bit different because of their theological beliefs, but a lot of similar stuff as well. And with respect to their miracle claims and doctrinal claims and other issues. But when applied to their own doctrines, and their own teachings, then they have all of these sort of defenses and various talking points that they have. But if you sort of average them together, you basically get an atheist. I guess the only exception there would be certain things that are held in common by theists, like perhaps creation. But even there, if you include like Buddhists and others who don't accept the traditional theistic conceptions, I think that you would still see something similar. Like an example of that would be the Buddhist teaching about some Buddhist teachings about the emptiness of self, right? That's actually kind of consistent with a sort of a non-essentialist view of self, which is typically held by more naturalists. What is this car doing? Not a lot. What are you going at like snail's pace, bro? Anyway, so the point there is that it's very interesting to see how different apologists react to each other, and how, to me, this just underlines the fact that what am I trying to say here? It underlines the fact that apologetics is really an exercise in special pleading a lot of the time. I'm not saying 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, it's finding special reasons to defend specific claims that, like, most other people don't accept. I mean, and this can happen for atheists as well, but there isn't that much atheist apologetics per se. Most of it is counter-apologetics, so it's a little bit different. Just walking your dog on the middle of the road, why not? And so I think that it's really important to avoid that sort of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Pitfalls of reasoning. So when you get in a position of just sort of defending a particular set of views that you hold, kind of no matter what, or at least irrespective of, without applying a consistent epistemic standard, let me put it that way. So we shouldn't have these beliefs that are just cut off from critical theorizing, or we never challenge. And a lot of people have these, right? Even if they're not maybe philosophical, maybe they're political. Bugger, am I not allowed to turn right here? That's a problem. I think I'll just turn around. Whether they're political or social beliefs, or like identity politics related beliefs, maybe that's it for some people. Or if you're a libertarian, like crazy beliefs there. Why is there a right turning lane if I can't turn right? Like, that doesn't make sense, does it? I guess I can just go straight ahead. Melbourne traffic's a little weird because we've got trams and things. But anyway, yeah, so this is, I think, really important. And I think you see some of that negative epistemic situation with really come out. Oh, bugger, I can't. Where the hell am I allowed to go here? Sorry, I've gotten slightly confused. I shouldn't have come this way. I think I can... Oh, okay, I can turn around that way. Yeah, it's fine. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and so I think that this happens quite a lot with in apologetics, and it's a bit frustrating to see. The thing is, though, that there are some people who are explicit about this. Like William Lane Craig, he just says, yeah, it's about defending the faith that I hold for non-rational reasons. Or maybe he doesn't say non-rational, but I guess like non-argument, like not for argument reasons, not for reasons of argument. He does say that. I mean, at that point, it's sort of like, I just see that as an explicit rejection of good epistemology. I guess then you come into the grounds of, like reformed epistemology, which I don't know that Craig explicitly accepts, but he certainly leans on some similar ideas of this idea of like intrinsic defeaters and such. Reformed epistemology is interesting. I probably don't want to get into that now. I reject some of the critical like presuppositions of that, but the point is that it's certainly unusual for us to use that sort of standard where we just sort of take a belief and think it's justified until we need to question it. Like usually if people ask you for reasons, they're like hoping that you'll give reasons for something and not just sort of say, I'm allowed to believe this without being able to articulate any reasons for it. I just think that that's a bit odd. It's a bit like if you think that providing reasons is something we do as a social practice, right? Like giving explanations and such. It seems to be a rather degenerate form of that that is countenanced by reformed epistemology, where it's just kind of like, well, I might not be able to articulate anything about my reasons and I'm still entirely justified, and so forth. It just seems kind of pointless. Like, how do we reconcile that sort of approach with a love of wisdom, right, and philosophical discourse? To me, it should be about finding out what the good reasons are for believing things and trying to bring our worldviews in line with what good reasons are and what reasons we have and the best evidence and such. Not about playing ever more intricate language games to try to find ways of wriggling out of problems. That just seems really lame to me. I don't know. I'm not interested in that. But yeah, I guess that can be what apologetics and counter-apologetics degenerates to sometimes. And that's certainly an issue that we need to be on the watch for. And that's some of the thing I've criticized, in some of the videos I've done. It's one of the reasons I don't like very formal philosophical arguments. Typically, it's just I don't know that the formalism adds a lot. An example of this gone to a crazy extreme is Maverick Christian. I'm sure it's Maverick Christian, right? He did the variation of his his own variation of Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. I forget exactly what he called it, and I debated him on this, where his original paper is just full of very dense logic that I did not want to devote the time to working through. And it seemed that even he didn't really understand his argument because he kept having to refer to the paper in our discussion, and at least in my view, wasn't very clear about exactly what different premises said when I asked him multiple times. But anyway, the point is that philosophy like that, I just don't find as useful. It's just really obfuscating rather than clarifying. There's a place for logic. I'm not saying that there's never a place for that, but it's similar to when you read an argument and it says, like, I don't know what the argument is about. For every person P at time T, there is a time T less than, T1 less than T when that person P takes action A such that, like, no one talks like that. Like, why do you have to write things like that? I actually don't know where this comes from, that style of writing. If you've read any philosophical paper ever, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's not even jargon so much. It's just introducing symbols for the sake of it that I don't think really add anything. Pretty much all of those I think could be rewritten without all of that nonsense and in a much clearer way. So the question again is, why do people write like that? It feels like it's just sort of a norm. Jesus, people everywhere. That is, I don't know, people get used to it or something. I mean, it's not universal, right? But it's just kind of another bugbear of mine. Philosophy should be about clarifying, not making things even more opaque. And some people say philosophy is just about debating the definitions of words. I think that particularly this criticism is most applicable in the analytic tradition since the linguistic turn, where philosophy has focused a lot more on language, which I think is good, actually. I think that philosophy is a lot about language, but it's not only about language, because you can stipulate whatever definition you like. And if it was purely about language, then, linguistics is the study of language, right? So I don't think philosophy is just linguistics, but I think it's more about trying to unpack, philosophy that is trying to unpack a lot of the key, very basic concepts, ideas that we use to make sense of the world. So things like space, time, causation, mind, person, good and bad, free will, God, all of these sorts of things, like really basic stuff that is kind of a bit hard to make sense of. Let's keep going. And I think philosophy is basically just trying to give a good account of what we're talking about here. And so a lot of that is going to be about language use, but it's not exclusively about language use. It does relate to the world beyond that, and we can reform language use and so forth. And that's why I think we do need to be cautious about trying to make philosophy do for us more than it really can by, there are some people who still seem to think that philosophy can deliver these sort of like deep truths of the cosmos. I don't even know quite how to phrase it. I'm pretty skeptical. I think a lot of particularly contemporary philosophers are pretty skeptical about that. Because the thing is, if philosophy is mostly about clarifying our concepts, it doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about the world beyond those concepts. Presumably there is a connection between our ideas, concepts, and the world, because we use the concepts successfully. They've developed for a reason, presumably. But that argument only gets you so far. And so, like, for example, let's give an example to put some meat on the bones here. So suppose that we're looking at philosophy of time, to take an example, right? So philosophers might be able to tell us about how we think of time and how we deploy the concepts of time in various ways. Oh, he's turning left. But are they able to tell us about the metaphysical structure of whatever time is in and of itself? There's maybe constraints they can place on that, like rational constraints on consistency, but I don't know that you can ever just do that through philosophical analysis, because at the end of the day, whatever our concepts of time are just could be wrong. At the end of the day, I think you're going to need to appeal to evidence beyond, analytic sort of conceptual considerations. And this is where I think people like, I'm going to pull him out again, William Lane Craig go wrong, because Craig thinks that through a purely conceptual type analysis and throughout also our everyday experience, we can know that time is tensed. And to make that a bit more specific, that entails that the past does not exist, right? So that's a pretty hefty sort of metaphysical claim. The past is unreal. How you can get that out of purely conceptual and like experiential analysis, I really don't know. But Craig and some other philosophers think that you can get that. And I just don't know why we would think philosophy is capable of delivering us such things. At most, I think what philosophy could do is put rational constraints on plausible theories of the way time could be. And it could also tell us about how we deploy time-related concepts and use them in language. And for some things that might be enough, right? So that's basically how I take morality to work. Well, let me explain what I mean there. I think that through a combination of conceptual analysis of how we think of and deploy moral terms and ideas, as well as rational constraints on possible theories of morality, that combined with some very general observations from well, I don't even want to say the sciences, but like, I don't know, anthropology, if you like. Put those together, and I think you can get a theory of morality out of that. But for other philosophical questions, such as the nature of mind or philosophy of time and space, I think you're going to need a lot more specific results from physics in order to get anything there, not just sort of very general observations. And so I think that it's a mistake to try to expect too much of philosophy in this respect. Anyway, I guess your mileage may vary about that sort of argument. I mean, and there are also people who think that there are, like maybe mathematics is the study of like Platonic forms or something. So did I say mathematics? Philosophy is the study of Platonic forms or some such things. In which case, maybe just like in mathematics, we can access them in a purely sort of a priori conceptual way. But I don't know. I don't really go into that sort of argument. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me what it could mean to have a Platonic forms that are part of reality, but like not part of causal reality or anything. Bugger. That's actually, Platonism is something that I want to read more about, because I don't really know much about how people defend it in terms of giving an account of Platonic objects. I know the arguments people give in favor of Platonism, but it's a little bit different to explaining like what Platonic objects are or how they work. The problem of how we can come to a knowledge of Platonic forms if they don't stand in causal relations with physical reality, I think, is a big one. I've tried to read a little bit about this. I know that one argument is to basically take the Aristotelian route and say that like the forms adhere in the exemplification of the form. So there's like there's not two like substances or something. The forms just sort of are, I don't know, instantiated in the concrete real objects. That seems more plausible to me, but then I just don't know what I don't know what explanatory work forms do in that context that you can't do by just sort of saying that there are structures in like physical reality. I don't know why we have to countenance forms or something. But if you don't want to take, and that's not even really Platonism anyway, that's more like Aristotelianism. Oh, bugger. Sorry, someone just walked behind me when I was reversing. It's not good. What was I going to say? Yeah, so what was the other approach? So I think that there is an approach that thinks that maybe abstract objects can stand in causal relations. I think that's a bit different. I don't quite know how that works. And I think the other one that I read was basically just saying that they don't need to stand in causal relations for us to know them. But I just don't really know how that makes sense. I guess some people don't feel the need to provide like an account of how we gain access to these sorts of things. I don't know. It's something that I want to read more about. But anyway, where was I going with that? Yeah, so the role of philosophy. Yeah, so it should be about trying to help us to clarify our concepts rather than to hit people over the head with. And I think that apologetics often goes wrong in that respect. Okay, I'm still in park. That's not good. Yeah, so what else did I want to talk about there? I think that apologists are particular. Does that mean I can turn or not? I never remember how hook turns work. In Melbourne, we have these really weird right-hand turns called hook turns, which I don't think happen anywhere else. I think I'm supposed to wait. Yeah, anyway, I think apologists are typically pretty weak on moral issues, actually. I'm trying to think of a major apologist who like actually makes good moral arguments, but most of them I think are, am I allowed to? Oh, it says wait. I'm confused. I think I'm supposed to go now. Yeah, like Craig's moral arguments are kind of a joke, right? He just sort of says, well, you can't have a secular, like a non-theistic meta-ethic. And when people ask him why, he just sort of says, because he doesn't think that they work. And then if you ask him, well, what you have to say about these specific theories, of which there are huge numbers, he just doesn't really have anything to say about it of substance. You know, it gets to things like, well, lions don't murder or rape, so how come humans do if we're all just, biological organisms, which is just a joke of an argument, but he just still uses it. Now, I know he's not the only person to make moral arguments, but many of the major apologists, particularly the popular ones, just don't seem to have very substantial philosophical points to say about this, which I think is really weird. Because like meta-ethics is a huge area of philosophy. It's probably one of the main areas where apologetics actually interacts most directly with, I have gone the most circuitous route possible to get to where I'm going, but never mind. Oh, bugger, do I have to turn? Yeah, it's probably the main area where apologetics actually interacts with mainstream philosophy, because most of the other issues are discussed mainly in philosophy of religion, like creation, Kalam arguments, for example, and fine-tuning, and other theological issues. But groundings of ethics, that is widely discussed in philosophy, even completely outside of philosophy of religion. So it's kind of weird that that's the area where a lot of apologists seem to be weakest. I don't know why that is. If that's like a strategy choice or what, like, because there's just so little engagement with mainstream meta-ethics for the most part. Yeah, so I don't really understand why these sort of arguments are still as popular as they are. Because Craig, honestly, like, he's never published anything in a scholarly journal about meta-ethics. I think the only case is a rewriting of a popular argument in an apologetics journal, and that's about it. Like, there's just not a lot of substance compared to what he's written on the Kalam and what he's written about the what's the other one? Oh, the resurrection argument. I'm thinking like people like Swinburne, Plantinga. I don't think they are big on moral arguments, at least from what I recall. I could be wrong there. Other big defenders just sort of parrot Craig, or they don't talk about it so much. Like, Habermas is big on the resurrection. I don't know that he talks too much about moral arguments. So I'm just trying to think of other big names. Many of them are popularizers who say similar things to what Craig says. Anyway, so yeah, that's weird. I wonder why it is the case that there's so little interchange there between theistic philosophers and, well, I guess more Christian apologists I'm specifically thinking, and mainstream meta-ethics. Because like, philosophically, that's probably the hardest to defend, right? Because very, very few philosophers think that morality is saved by God, essentially, which is what Craig says. Because most people who are like error theorists, like Mackey, didn't think God helped. And it's unclear how God does help for things like the open question argument or the... I do not know if I can do a U-turn here. But it doesn't say I'm not allowed to, so I'm going to do one. Yeah, so the open question argument, which is basically an argument against like analytic definitions of morality. And then there's the objections on the basis of the queerness. So that's Mackey's argument, that the queerness of like moral values, that they have to be like intrinsically motivating or something. It's not clear that theism really does anything to respond to those arguments against moral realism, or deal with moral motivation or other things like that. It really only provides God's commands as a basis for morality, but not like most people. That the arguments given against moral realism are typically not ones that the existence of divine commands has any bearing on. So the point I'm making here is pretty much, I just don't know many meta-ethicists who think that, apart from Christian apologists, who think that morality is somehow saved by divine commands or a similar sort of theory. You know, people who are non-cognitivists about morality think that morality is not even in the business of asserting truths. It's in the business of, well, something else. Maybe it's emotive projections or imperative commands or something. And in that case, moral arguments aren't really going to be that relevant. So it's just such a fringe view, and philosophically, I think it's going to be hard to get off the ground. Probably the argument for God's existence that's taken most seriously within the academy would probably be the fine-tuning argument, and I think that's the one where the theists have. I've long said that it's the best argument for the existence of God. I still don't think it's a very good argument, but it has fewer problems than most of the other arguments. And I think the premises are more plausible. The main issue is trying to establish why God would fine-tune a universe. But again, that side of it is just usually not discussed. And it comes back to what I was saying before about, do theists require, and apologists require, the same standards of a theistic explanation than they do of a naturalistic or an atheistic explanation? And it seems that they don't, right? Because I mean, the video that Nathan and I did with the Skyfill and the other Daniel, in response to Craig's response to the philosopher video about the Kalam, right? This came up there, where Craig would object, or does object, to models of the beginning of the universe, well, like scientific models would require a beginning, right? He would object to them on the basis that they can't explain this or that or issue, or can't deal with this technical detail or that technical detail or whatever it be. But he never required that for for his preferred explanation, which is essentially just God did it. And he doesn't require that predict or explain anything really, or give or why God created or any of these sorts of issues. That sort of, Craig typically says, is an internal issue, right? And he just sort of wipes it off the table as if it doesn't need an explanation. But I don't think that's satisfactory. As I said before, if you're going to require that naturalist explanations tick all these boxes, then why doesn't the theist explanation have to also tick all those boxes, so to speak? Oh, well, I'm going. So I think that's, coming back to fine-tuning, I think that's how it is able to, it's why people take it as, it's why many people find it as persuasive as they do, is because they don't think about the question as to what explanation is actually given for why God fine-tunes or why he needs to fine-tune at all. Because if you're just going to say, I don't know, he just feels like it, or that's the way he wants to do it, that's just a brute fact. Or you can just say it's a brute fact that the constants are fine-tuned and you're at the same place. So I think that's the key weakness of a lot of these arguments, is to explain why they're to give an account as to why they're explanatorily superior to naturalistic explanations, which just make ad hoc postulates. Because the theists make ad hoc postulates as well. So where is the explanatory value coming from? I think that I've heard Craig respond to this at least once. I don't think he talks about it too much. I finally found where I'm actually trying to get to here. Now I just have to find somewhere to park, actually. Let's go this way. Saying, yeah, so I think once Craig basically said, you don't need to provide an explanation for why God would act in a certain way and not in a different way. Because, I mean, libertarian agency just sort of works that way. You just sort of, they make a choice or they make a decision, and that's all there is. So Craig just doesn't think those things need to be explained. But remember, sort of part of the almost definition of a libertarian choice is that it's a choice that is made without, there is no further explanation as to why that choice was made. It's simply a brute fact that that choice was made and not another choice. If you can give a reason, then it's not really libertarian agency, right? It's sort of that further cause or underlying determination of why the action was taken. It's just supposed to be a brute fact. So if you're a libertarian about free will, your view of reality is undergirded by a huge raft, or I don't know, sea of rafts of brute facts, which I think is quite unsatisfactory. Now, that might be, it actually is possible that might be true anyway if there is fundamental randomness in reality, but at least that's more constrained because you can give probabilities for things. Like if QM, if quantum mechanics is fundamentally stochastic, then there's going to be brute facts about, like, you know, why does the atom decay at this point rather than another point in time. But that is at least governed by, oh, come on, let me turn around. That at least is given by very well described probabilities, whereas that's not true for libertarian agency. So there's even less structure. And besides, that's not really going to help because the libertarian has to deal with however QM is. Plus, they're going to have all these brute facts about libertarian agents that are their own thing. So it's going to add extra problems. So, but you could be a libertarian about human agency and not about divine agency. That's a separate issue. I don't know how many people go down that road, but you could, right? And so then the issue would be, well, all of God's actions, or at least, well, yeah, I mean, I assume all of them, are basically just brute facts. Like, there's no explanation for why he took any of them. Maybe there are reasons. The reasons aren't causes, though. And even there, it's not clear that there are reasons. Like, if, you know, God is self-sufficient, then how can he have reasons for doing things? I don't really understand that. But, okay, this is only 2p. What are you doing? Oh, they got a flat. I'd like 4p, please. Oh, wait, no, that's only on Saturdays. Yeah, finding a parking in the city is always a joy, even though it's Sunday today. But anyway, oh, crap. So, is it really a good explanation to have undergirding reality all of these brute facts, especially when it's stuff like, you know, God choosing to make things this way? I just don't understand how that's a better explanation than just saying it's just a brute fact that it is that way, as opposed to God made it that way, and it's a brute fact as to why he made it that way. Like, I really don't get it. And I've not been able to coax what I regard as a cogent response to this from really any theist that I've talked to. Not saying there isn't one. One has to be cautious there. I don't know everything about what they say, but certainly Craig doesn't seem very interested in explaining his take on this. He just doesn't think that it needs an explanation. And I mean, if that's your intuition, then it's kind of the end of the discussion, right? Aha. If you just have the intuition that certain things don't need an explanation, then you can just push everything, right, to that sort of thing. If divine actions don't need an explanation, then just push all mysteries to divine actions, because then everything is in a position where it doesn't need a further explanation, right? That's pretty much get out of jail free card with respect to accounting for things in reality, right? And I feel like this is what the apologists do. How do you account for morality? Morality is a bit tricky. God. How do you account for the beginning of the universe? God. How do you account for the fine-tuning or apparent fine-tuning of the universe? God. How do you account for, you know, like strange miracles or apparent miracle claims? God. How do you account for, well, you know, it's just always God, right? And when you ask, well, but why did God do this, or why in this way, the answer is you just don't need to have an explanation for that. It's fine. Is that really what we want to do with our epistemology? I mean, like, that seems pretty crap to me. That seems really undermotivated. Oh, come on, 1p, Sat to Sunday. What am I going to do with 1 hour? So here's the update on parking. I'm sure this is of great interest. I've got 2Ps available, but I wanted 4P because I might stay a bit longer than 2 hours. And I don't really think that the parking inspectors work on Easter Sunday, but you never can be sure about these things. Come on, man. Why is it less on Sunday? That's just so weird. It's 4P the other days, but it's 2P on a Sunday. It's usually the opposite. Maybe I'll just have to deal with 2P and move it if I need to. I think we might have to go with that. Anyway, so yeah, I'm about ready to finish up here. So what was the concluding remark? Yeah, so basically, here's the bottom line of it. If we're going to explain things through divine action, then either divine actions need explanation or they don't. If divine actions need explanation, well, then that's a problem for the theist, right? Because, well, they're going to need to provide us with lots and lots of explanations. And often I don't think they can do that very plausibly. On the other hand, if divine actions don't need explanations, then we kind of need a story as to why divine actions and only divine actions don't need explanations. Or, I mean, maybe it's libertarian choices, right, which would include divine actions. But even there, we're still going to need an explanation as to why those things don't need explanations. It seems implausible to me, and I think you can give some pretty reasonable arguments. So if you think that explanations are whatever answers a why question, you can certainly ask why questions about all of the same things. Why did God create? Why did he fine tune? You know, they're perfectly reasonable questions to ask. So it's not clear off the bat why they wouldn't have explanations. If you think that to provide an explanation is to provide a cause of something, causal theory of explanation, then that's all going to come down to how you understand like agent causation. And I think that that's a big kettle of fish there. But it's sort of not obvious how that's supposed to work. And also, it's not clear that divine actions are going to be unique in that respect of not requiring explanations there. There are probably going to be other sorts of things that don't require wait, 12 p.m. Yes, okay, so theoretically I can park here, but I think they're all taken. Oh, wait, no, it's driveway. Yeah, so then what other roads are there? Well, you could just say that divine actions don't need explanation and there's no explanation for that. Okay, that's a permit zone. Like, there's no philosophical account to be given. Aha, I found a spot. Excellent, persistence paid off. All right, yeah, so divine explanations, not very good. Thanks for listening to my ramblings while I drove. This has just been an experiment, so I don't know if I'll even leave this stream up. We'll have to see if people found it useful. Why has that happened? It's the wrong way. Yeah, anyway, so let me know what you thought about this. If this was of interest, I'll maybe do some more in the future and hopefully get a proper stand. But I'm off to a picnic now. See you guys. Take care. How do I stop streaming? Like, seriously, I don't know how to. Do I just press that? Yes.